Welcome. My name is Manuel Roman Lacayo. I am the Associate Director for the Center for Latin American Studies at the University of Pittsburgh. This is the 13th iteration of the Charlemos series. Today's topic, radical versus moderate voters in Latin America. Andres Mejia Acosta will moderate a conversation with Juan Moraes, Diego Luján, and Lucio Renaud. And without further ado, I want to leave you with Andres Mejia Acosta. Thank you.
Gracias, Manuel. Good evening from London and good afternoon in the Americas. It's a pleasure for me to moderate what is now the 13th edition of the Charlemos series to discuss, as Manuel said, radical versus moderate voters in Latin America. For this conversation, we have Juan Andrés Moraes and Diego Luján from the Universidad de la República in Uruguay, who will be discussing their 2020 LAR paper, a Latin American Research Review paper, The Electoral Success of the Left in Latin America. Is there any room for spatial models of voting? And Lucio Renaud from the Universidad de Brasilia with the 2020 paper that was published in Latin American Politics and Society, the Bolsonaro voter, issue positions, and vote choice in the 2018 Brazilian presidential elections. I'm moderating this discussion in lieu of Jennifer Sir, who unfortunately could not be here today due to having contracted COVID over the weekend. So we wish her and all her family a speedy recovery. And we will take the steps so we can have a more gender balanced panel in the future. So we are in full swing, full electoral swing in Latin America with recent general elections in Nicaragua, Salvador, Ecuador, Peru, and forthcoming general elections in Haiti, Chile, and legislative and subnational elections in Mexico and Argentina. The timing for this conversation could not have been better, as we are going to discuss two solid theoretical and empirical papers on voting and polarization. They are written about different periods of time using different methodologies, and they reach somewhat different conclusions that we will talk about in this conversation. One paper, the Moraes-Luján paper, compares directional and spatial voting models using data from the comparative study of electoral systems for 5 Latin American countries between 1994 and 2014. The other paper uses data from the 2018 Brazilian electoral panel study to explore how policy positions and cultural factors influenced voter choice during the Bolsonaro election in 2018. So let me welcome my colleagues and good friends and start with a question that leads the panel. Which is the predominant strategy? Is it moderates or radicals? In Juan Andres and Diego's paper, you both argue that the success of the left rests on the provision of clear leftist programmatic cues to voters, whereas Lucio argues that there might be an alignment of social and moral conservatism, economic liberalism, and vote choice, something that is new in Brazil, which explains the Bolsonaro vote. So in other words, the one paper is focusing on the adoption of a moderate programmatic agenda to explain left-wing victories, whereas the other argues that it was a combination of issues and cultural sentiments, which explains the victory of the right. I wanted to ask you, to what extent can party leaders polarize an electorate, and whether this ability would be very much depending on the existing party institutionalization of every country, or is this something that could be manipulated at any point in time? Is it more of a demand-driven or a supply-driven mobilization of voters? I don't know who wants to start, perhaps Juan and Diego.
Sí, bueno, antes que nada, muchas gracias por la invitación. Un saludo obviamente a Jennifer, que está en proceso de recuperación, y gracias a ustedes por la organización de este foro, que me parece de gran utilidad para discutir avances en política comparada. Yo, digamos, arrancaría en parte mi respuesta con la forma que tenemos de encarar nosotros el trabajo. Digamos, en la literatura nosotros lo que observamos es que predomina algo así como un enfoque de demanda, ¿no? donde se sostiene que los partidos de izquierda ganaron cortejando al votante mediano, que es un votante moderado, por lo menos en la mayor parte de los países de América Latina, salvo algunas excepciones con cierto sesgo, pero muy menor hacia la derecha. De tal modo que, digamos, la izquierda en América Latina logró acceder a, por lo menos las primeras victorias electorales, con un traslado, con un cierto corrimiento hacia el centro del espectro. Digamos, y eso es básicamente un enfoque, digamos, de demanda, que es, a mi juicio, lo que ha predominado en años recientes. Yo diría que nuestro enfoque es más bien un enfoque de oferta, digamos, donde los partidos están más bien donde eligen estratégicamente localizarse en el espectro. Digamos, no tanto en función de la dictadura del votante mediano, sino en función de decisiones estratégicas de donde consideran que las elecciones o la elección puede ser electoralmente más fructífera, y al mismo tiempo digamos, asignándole o dándole señales claras desde el punto de vista programático o ideológico a los votantes. Entonces, básicamente los partidos, a nuestro entender, ganaron con una señal clara desde, una señal programática clara desde la izquierda. Yo creo que ese argumento es compatible con lo que vos estás preguntando con respecto a la polarización, ¿no? Ya sea hacia la izquierda como hacia la derecha. Por supuesto que está en disputa toda esta discusión, porque no sabemos todavía cuánto, por lo menos no tenemos suficientes datos para estimar, digamos, algunos datos en América Latina de elecciones recientes donde ha ganado la centro-derecha y la derecha. Pero me parece que es un argumento compatible, ¿no? Porque para ganar algunos partidos o candidatos prefieren dar señales programáticas claras en vez de morir licuados en el centro del espectro ideológico. Entonces, digamos, a inicios de los 2000, yo diría que el votante mediano o moderado no encontró en el centro ideológico una oferta programática, digamos, satisfactoria, ¿no? Porque, digamos, en buena medida el centro ideológico estuvo fuertemente involucrado con buena parte de las políticas implementadas durante décadas anteriores, y yo diría que buena parte de esos partidos de centro derecha carecían de reputación suficiente en el electorado para manejar la economía, para disminuir la pobreza, etcétera, etcétera. Así que, digamos, la izquierda ofrecía un conjunto de opciones programáticas identificables y atractivas para el electorado. No sé si tengo un segundo más para decir algo con respecto a tu pregunta de polarización, pero en todo caso lo dejamos a Lucio y volvemos sobre este punto.
Sí, dale, volvemos con el tema de polarización después. Sí. Lucio, ¿qué opinas? ¿La estrategia de Bolsonaro es una estrategia de oferta?
Yes, thank you so much for inviting me and to be here with Andres and friends that I haven't seen in a long time and that I like very much. Talking about this, what I think is a very important topic in Brazilian politics. We would have to think how this travels elsewhere in Latin America, which is this relatively new alignment of radical right-wing issue positions among the electorate. So there's obviously an aspect of this that emerged in Brazilian politics, and it's difficult to disentangle the direction. If this was promoted and in some ways shown to be a possibility by Bolsonaro, so it would be elite driven in that sense, or if he was learning from what people were talking and discussing in the streets, and then it would be something driven through demand for this. It's obviously a convergence of these two elements. The presence of Bolsonaro with a very harsh rhetoric that coordinated different conservative right-wing positions that mark Latin American politics, I would say, in recent times, like a mano dura approach to law and order, economic neoliberalism, social and moral conservatism, conservadorismo. Alongside some new issues that now have come up, like things related to the pandemic and downplaying the pandemic and a negationist approach, issues related to agrotóxicos and food production, all of those things have emerged somehow to become debates in the publics in Latin America. And Bolsonaro has an important role in amalgamating or catalyzing these debates when he emerges publicly in doing so, because they weren't before organized in that way by any of the Brazilian political forces in such a very clear and well-defined manner. But obviously there's resonance with the Brazilian public. These things didn't emerge from nothing. They had been there maybe in a latent mode. And it's possible to think as well that the success of the left in gaining power, but then maybe its difficulties in managing the economy in Brazil and the political system in Brazil may have given extra stamina or strength to a resentment of left-wing parties, and especially in Brazil, the Workers' Party. Antipetismo is an important concept that has to do with this resentment of specific left-wing parties. And it would include actually more than the PT in a way, because the context of elections are also very important to understand, you know, victories and defeats. And the context of the 2018 election in Brazil was one that was very much prone for an outsider to gain visibility and to gain support because of the somewhat desgaste or you know, erosion, yeah, great word, of the political elites, of the dominant political parties and or the mainstream political parties in Brazil in the period, all of them involved in corruption scandals. So the conjunction of concomitant political and economic crisis in Brazil led to an increasing resentment of mainstream parties, especially the PT, the Workers' Party, which was coupled by resentment against the left, and therefore opened the opportunity for this new alignment, a very radical and extreme right-wing alignment in Brazil that didn't exist before. So again, it's a conjunction of
ability to tap into this discontent that mobilizes the new voters, as you say, building on a latent discontent that was there already.
Absolutely right, Andres. I think that's a good way to put what has been happening in Brazil regarding the political behavior of at least a quarter, and here we're talking about 25% approximately. That's what my research has shown. It has been consistent over the years of support for this more extreme, radical right-wing position in the country that has Bolsonaro as a spokesperson and one of its mentors, but it also obviously resonates with values and attitudes in the population.
One of the nice things about your paper, and to the audience here, I absolutely recommend you read and download. Both papers are available on the website for Charlemos. Is this distinction between issues and feelings and sentiments, and how you can capture a measurement for each, and then see that there are in fact complementing and reinforcing effects between one and the other. And a question I had for Diego is, perhaps could it be that in the age of mass media and fake news, could it become easier now to blend the two, the issues and the feelings, into perhaps one new form of populism where candidates are able to mobilize and activate support regardless of actual policy outcomes? So you generate this sense that issues and feelings are one and the same thing, regardless of what is happening in reality. I'm very much thinking probably the early months of Bolsonaro, even the early months during the COVID crisis. We have the AMLO factor in Mexico, of how the perception seems to be above and beyond sort of realities on the ground.
Bueno, creo que, a ver, antes que nada, muchas gracias por la invitación y le mandamos desde aquí un afectuoso saludo a Jennifer y una pronta recuperación para ella y su familia. A ver, yo creo que tanto lo que Juan Andrés como Lucio recién estaban expresando, me parece que habla acerca de que efectivamente hay una combinación de elementos programáticos, de elementos ideológicos, con elementos que no son estrictamente ideológicos, pero que sí son muy importantes, que tienen que ver con sentimientos y tienen que ver con valores, sobre todo a los que Lucio recién hacía una clara referencia. Y a mí me parece que lo que nosotros tratamos de mostrar con Andrés en el artículo es que el giro a la izquierda no fue uniforme en el sentido de que no tuvo detrás los mismos determinantes para todos los casos que conforman el giro, ¿no? En particular, lo que nosotros encontramos en los casos analizados, entre los cuales está Brasil, pero también hay otros países, es que las elecciones inaugurales, es decir, las elecciones que dieron origen a los gobiernos de izquierda, estuvieron muy fuertemente basadas en elementos y en señales ideológicas, y por el contrario, las elecciones que reeligieron a los partidos o a los presidentes de izquierda fueron mucho más motivadas por cuestiones de balance, ¿no? Por cuestiones de valor, sobre todo cuestiones que tienen que ver con cómo los votantes evaluaron la gestión de los gobiernos de izquierda. Cuando los gobiernos de izquierda fueron evaluados como gobiernos eficaces, entonces en general se tendieron a reelegir sobre esa base y no necesariamente de manera tan obvia sobre bases ideológicas. Y mi impresión, pero esto obviamente es solo una opinión porque no lo tenemos nosotros medidos, al menos en nuestro trabajo, es que cuando los electorados sacaron a los gobiernos de izquierda, los sacaron también en buena medida sobre la base de cuestiones de valor. Cuestiones como la corrupción explican muy fuertemente no solamente el voto a Bolsonaro, como muy bien lo señala Lucio, sino que también hay otros casos en América Latina donde los gobiernos de izquierda fueron estigmatizados con ese componente de que son gobiernos corruptos, y por lo tanto yo esto lo marcaría como en tres etapas. El ascenso de los partidos de izquierda estuvo para nosotros muy fuertemente vinculado a señales ideológicas claras y de izquierda, pero luego la reelección y la alternancia estuvieron, obviamente que también motivados ideológicamente, pero con una fuerte carga valórica que no habían tenido de pronto en las elecciones inaugurales del ciclo, ¿no?
No, complementando lo que acaba de decir Diego, digamos, yo creo que es una de las implicaciones en parte de lo que nosotros observamos, es que incluso mirando los dos puntos o las dos elecciones que nosotros analizamos para Brasil, donde una parece tener un claro signo programático, que es la del 2002, digamos, que es algo que no se reedita o no parece reeditarse en el 2010, donde parecen haber componentes más de balance, ¿no? O de evaluación del PT en el gobierno, y parecen primar otros asuntos que no son estrictamente ideológicos. Digamos, como una implicación es que, digamos, como que los países no atraviesan un umbral a partir del cual se vuelven programáticos, ¿no? Entonces, cuando uno ve esas dos elecciones, probablemente algunos se puede haber hecho la ilusión en el 2002 o a partir del 2002 de que habían señales de programaticidad en el sistema de partidos brasileños. No sé, Lucio me debería corregir con respecto a este punto. Pero, digamos, eso se desvanece en 2010 y probablemente sigan habiendo señales en esa misma dirección. Pero pasa algo muy similar a lo que ocurre con los estudios de clase en América Latina, donde es posible encontrar puntos en el tiempo en una serie de elecciones en un país donde están, digamos, signadas por un fuerte componente de voto de clase que no se reeditan a través del tiempo, ¿no?
Perfecto.
Entonces,
No, y quería volver sobre este punto, sobre la existencia de un umbral, ¿no? Que no es un camino de una sola vía, sino que pueden haber reversals en este sentido. Corremos rápido en contra del tiempo y quiero cerrar con una última pregunta sobre metodología y research agendas. Both papers make extensive use of very sophisticated and detailed data sets on voting preferences, socioeconomic indicators, and panel data that was not available to study in Latin American politics only just a decade ago. So where do we go from here? Does it still make sense that we keep talking about ideological waves to the turn or turns to the left or turns to the right, when Latin American countries are in fact becoming more diverse and divergent? Only last night we had elections in Ecuador, which showed an unexpected, clear anti-populist swing, anti-Correísta vote, despite having the economic crisis, corruption scandals, and all that, and people decided to vote against that. So what would be the relevant research agenda to capture the dynamic changing realities of Latin American elections? Lucio?
Thank you, Andres. That's a very easy question, for which I have no idea, actually. It's a great question. Yeah, it's a great question. No, I mean, I would say that we have somewhat forgotten about the importance of political issues and programmatic discussions in Latin America over the years. I mean, there's a long tradition in saying that the vote in Latin America is to a great extent personalistic or clientelistic, or based on the influence of the media, or exclusively on feelings, right, Diego, and not really counterbalancing the actual proposals and what different candidacies and parties actually represent ideologically, or even in more simple terms, in relation to specific issues that people care about. And that are not necessarily just balance issues. There are issues that divide society in some aspects. And I think we need to keep paying attention to these issues without ignoring how they in some ways relate to feelings and evaluations based on sentiments, right? Regarding politics, and how issues and these more sentimental evaluations of politics interact to create more polarization and to divide more the different publics. And obviously you need to capture that, and there are many ways to do so empirically. Obviously you can still rely on the traditional forms of survey and data collection and public opinion data collection in its diverse forms, but quantitatively, which is what we tend to do a lot. But also I think there's more and more space for more qualitative approaches to capture how, feelings and emotions in one hand interact with issues in creating polarization in the different countries of the region. So I think that would be something that would interest me in research in the near future.
Diego?
Bueno, creo que coincido con Lucio acerca de que es una pregunta súper interesante, muy compleja de taclear. Yo diría dos cosas. Primero, hay efectivamente un enorme campo para seguir avanzando, sobre todo en investigación sobre comportamiento electoral basado en modelos espaciales, ¿no? Es decir, en América Latina la aplicación de los modelos espaciales ha sido, en el mejor de los casos, metafórica, ¿no? Es decir, el teorema del votante mediano ha estado siempre sobrevolando de alguna forma el análisis electoral, pero no han sido muchas las ocasiones en donde se han extraído hipótesis que se derivaron del teorema del votante mediano y se han sometido a pruebas empíricas, ¿no? Entonces a mí me parece que allí hay en estudio electoral un campo fértil para seguir avanzando, probablemente con algunas de las cuestiones que recién mencionaba Lucio, es decir, cómo podemos hacer más complejos los modelos espaciales incorporando cuestiones que ya se han venido incorporando desde hace un tiempo, que tienen que ver con parámetros no espaciales, que pueden ser de valores, de sentimientos, de emociones, y cómo las cuestiones espaciales y no espaciales interactúan para explicar los resultados. Creo que por ahí hay una fuente de inspiración para el futuro.
¿Juancho?
No, estoy de acuerdo con cualquiera de los dos. La agenda es enorme. Sí. digamos, probablemente por una cuestión de un sesgo personal, me parece que sabemos poco todavía, a pesar de que han habido avances importantes en años recientes, pero todavía sabemos poco sobre digamos, la naturaleza de los votantes en América Latina. Sabemos muy poco
Una
todavía.
pregunta propia que tenía y que obviamente nos metemos en terrenos más complejos es hasta qué punto la distribución espacial, ideológica o incluso de sentimientos de los votantes se traduce en el siguiente piso, por ejemplo, en elecciones legislativas, y hasta qué punto forman partidos más ideológicos, más issue-driven, más, qué sé yo, clientelares, ¿no? Y me parece que si ese tipo de investigación era como muy presente en cómo los clivajes se transforman en partidos políticos, ahora nos hemos movido un poco en la dirección opuesta, ¿no? Nos hemos olvidado de esa conexión con la parte de partidos y representación legislativa a partir de las preferencias electorales. Creo que vamos a abrir un espacio. Tenemos algunas preguntas de un público bastante especializado. Y voy a empezar con la pregunta de Dudley Ankerson. Son dos preguntas en realidad en torno a la polarización. Y la propuesta parece ser que la estrategia de polarizar ha dado resultados tanto en Bolivia como en México. Dice, it seems to me that Bolivia is a clear example of the politics of revenge since 2019, building upon an increasing polarization. It's interesting to observe how Andrés Manuel López Obrador is actively seeking to polarize society in order to bolster his political base. As in Bolivia, this leaves very little space for the centrist voter. I would be very interested in the comments of the speakers.
I think this is a very interesting point. I think I'll focus more in Brazil to respond to this question, but again, we have to be very careful with how these things travel. I think there's a lot of context-specific aspects of these discussions that apply more to certain cases than to others. I think I would say that, considering what's happening in Brazil now. So we have to take into consideration looking into the present and the near future when we'll have elections, in the case of Brazil, 2022, the next general elections. And we have to take into consideration now the pandemic. I don't think we can really understand in some ways what's going to, how politics will behave in the next 2 years and how campaigns will be organized without mention specifically to the case of the governmental reaction to the pandemic. In Brazil, that's absolutely, that's going to be absolutely the case because of the incumbent president's positions towards the pandemic, which are, he's seen as a prototypical negationist that downplays the seriousness of the disease, and that has affected governmental response to it, and it obviously has an effect on the numbers we're having in Brazil now, completely in contradiction with the rest of the world. We're having about 4,000 people dying a day in 24 hours presently in Brazil, which is something that's not happening anywhere else in the country. And it's obviously linked to how the government has positioned itself against scientific solutions for the pandemic, including vaccinations, which they adhered to this idea just recently. So that's going to certainly come up. And there's a significant fatigue in the population towards incumbents. I think that in Brazil, and that has been somewhat the case around Latin America, given the economic crises and also the constant political turbulence. It's not easy to be an incumbent in Latin America, and that's specifically so in the case of Brazil if you're Bolsonaro and you won't shut up. So, I mean, people are really getting tired of it. They're getting fed up of it. And that poses the issue of the possibility of a moderate candidate gaining visibility, which is the issue, right, that Lee brings up here when he's talking about this little space for centrist voter. I would say it depends on the performance of the incumbent. In the case of Brazil, there's a lot of negative reaction and growing negative reaction, including of an effective nature towards the government that is probably reducing even further its group of supporters to a very strong and crystallized conservative backbone of Bolsonaro's predominance. It might be sufficient to take him to a second round, but it's certainly not sufficient to allow him to win the next election. So there's a lot of space for alternatives. This was wide open until Lula da Silva became a candidate again, and the Workers' Party became Lula's way of becoming a candidate, given the suspension of his criminal convictions by the Supreme Court not more than 2 or 3 weeks ago. So this political scenario in Brazil, which was quite open, I would say, until very recently, has closed again in this polarized environment between the Workers' Party and Bolsonarismo. And only that would explain, in my view, the restricted space for a centrist voter or a centrist candidate to emerge now in Brazil. It has become much harder, but it wasn't, and it became much harder because you have both polls organized now, and before you had only one of them well-defined. So I would say that in the case of Brazil, there was more space for a centrist alternative until very recently, when the political market has closed quite significantly, I would say, with the electoral reappearance of Lula da Silva from the Workers' Party.
Great. Thank you, Lucio. Let me move into, we still haven't touched the Bolivia and Mexico case, but we'll come back to this element. I will move on to the Sergio Huertas. Saludos para Diego y Juan. Ustedes terminan en su paper diciendo, arguably, the electoral success of non-centrist candidates in the region may help to account not only for the wave of left-wing governments, but also a possible right-wing turn in the near future. En ese escenario, y a partir de lo que vemos en las últimas elecciones, podríamos pensar que la teoría direccional puede explicar de mejor manera los movimientos electorales en América Latina. ¿Qué otras teorías consideran que pueden ayudar a explicar este comportamiento electoral?
Bueno, no, en realidad, a ver, es una pregunta interesante sobre la que estamos trabajando actualmente con Juan Andrés, en tratar de ver si digamos, si para explicar el giro siguiente, el giro a la derecha, que por el momento es un giro de una magnitud menor, pero que sí existe, alcanza con multiplicar por -1 el modelo de la izquierda, ¿no? Y en realidad lo que estamos viendo, sin mucha evidencia todavía firme, es que el modelo direccional funciona efectivamente bien para explicar momentos, como decía Juan Andrés hace un rato, ¿no? Momentos programáticos en donde hay una necesidad, en donde el votante mediano tiene más necesidad de cambiar la dirección de la política que de llevarla al punto de su preferencia, ¿no? Entonces yo creo que yo diría que sí, el modelo direccional es muy útil para analizar el comportamiento en América Latina. Yo diría no solamente en América Latina, a priori no pienso que la política latinoamericana sea tan particular como para ser tan distinta a la política en cualquier otra parte del mundo, y sí creo que hay un componente ideológico más fuerte. Ahora, si esto es una cuestión de largo plazo o no, habría que verlo. Entre otras cosas, tiene que ver con lo que hablábamos hace un rato acerca de cuánto han predominado elementos no espaciales, ¿no? Entonces, pero sí me queda bastante claro que en algunos casos, por ejemplo el de Bolivia, ha habido una reprogramatización del sistema, es decir, el ascenso del MAS en Bolivia ha llevado a que el sistema se tense ideológicamente como no lo estaba antes. Y sí, también creo que es probable que las alternativas que surjan en el futuro no surjan en el centro, ¿no? De hecho, los problemas que ha tenido la derecha o la centroderecha boliviana para articular una candidatura potente tiene que ver con que no hubo una candidatura espejo, ¿no? Con la misma fuerza ideológica que la del MAS en su momento. Entonces, creo sí que el modelo direccional tiene todavía mucho para ofrecer en el análisis de comportamiento electoral en América Latina.
Andrés, no sé si puedo hacer un comentario muy breve para agregar a lo que acaba de decir Diego. A mí una de las cosas que me resultan muy interesantes de los datos de Lucio es que digamos, sus datos más bien abonan, cuando uno mira las salidas de las regresiones, los datos de Lucio abonan, digamos, el hecho de que estamos frente a la naturaleza de un animal distinto desde el punto de vista programático. La derecha brasilera es, digamos, es distinta, ¿no? O sea, no, no parece tener el mismo vigor que tiene el petismo del lado de la izquierda, ¿no? O sea, de hecho, vos mostrás que digamos, el voto a la derecha tiene un fuerte componente de balance, no, digamos, no tan guiado por cuestiones ideológicas, sino por el antipetismo y la evaluación del
Una mezcla, ¿no? De
sí,
ambos.
una mezcla, pero digamos, no es un voto digamos, fuertemente ideológico, programático, el de derecha, por más que hay un componente asociado a valores, a algunas preferencias de política en áreas que vos destacás en tu trabajo. Pero digamos, detrás de la victoria del bolsonarismo hay un fuerte componente no programático, ¿no? Lo cual abona el argumento de que, digamos, un modelo direccional no estaría funcionando adecuadamente en la elección que llevó a Bolsonaro a su victoria.
Mm. Quiero volver sobre este punto de quizás la estrategia de la derecha es diferente a la estrategia de la izquierda. Hay una pregunta algo relacionada, pero volveremos al punto más de lleno. La pregunta es de Carlos Jalil. Left parties in Latin America are normally characterized by large public spending. When there's a government shift to a right party, as the one from Ecuador yesterday, such right-wing government has to adopt unpopular measures to cope with economic deficit, essentially austerity measures. How would these impact on voters? And could be a research or austerity would push voters to the left, as in Argentina.
Bueno, muy brevemente, a mí me parece que esto está conectado en parte a los giros de izquierda a derecha. Me parece que hay, eso es algo que nosotros no vemos, yo creo que Lucio tampoco, digamos, las policy implications de nuestros trabajos, pero me parece que es evidente que gobiernos de izquierda y derecha tienen preferencias de políticas distintas, y me parece que lo hemos podido ver en una serie de acciones que han emprendido tanto el gobierno de Bolsonaro en Brasil como la calle, por ejemplo, en Uruguay más recientemente en el último año. Entonces,
sí, un
sí
poco la
hay,
pregunta sería si es que es un efecto de austeridad pura, de austeridad fiscal y recorte de gasto, y por ende afecta al incumbent, o es un efecto ideológico, que cuando la derecha recorta el gasto, sufre más que cuando la izquierda recorta el gasto, no sé.
Bueno, yo, a ver, perdón, puedo...
Sí.
No, a ver, creo que hay una tendencia a, digamos, para decirlo de otro modo, si un gobierno de derecha recorta el gasto, estaría cumpliendo de alguna manera con su mandato. Mientras que si un gobierno de izquierda recorta el gasto, lo estaría violando el mandato. Entonces, creo que a los fines de la estructuración programática del sistema, uno debería pensar que las medidas de ajuste a las que se puede ver obligado un gobierno si es de derecha van a ser menos nocivas para la estructuración programática del sistema que si esas mismas medidas las tuviera que tomar un gobierno de izquierda. Ahora, esto no implica necesariamente que un partido de derecha sufra menos por llevar adelante políticas de ajuste, porque entre otras cosas lo que vemos en el paper es que una vez que hay una elección inaugural motivada ideológicamente, luego ese gobierno se empieza a jugar mucho en términos de su evaluación de gestión, y entonces tanto gobiernos de derecha como gobiernos de izquierda, si la gestión de la política económica es mala, van a tener algún tipo de castigo. Si es suficiente o no para que pierdan el gobierno, bueno, habrá que verlo caso a caso, ¿no? Pero la tendencia general debería ser esa.
Okay. I have a question from Javier Corrales, and Matt Singer has also a very interesting question. Let me read Javier's. Is there a way to predict by looking at voters' preferences when a party system will hyper-fractionalize in semi-authoritarian regimes? Una pregunta muy específica, Javier.
Andres, can you read the next question as well? Because I think we can link these three questions in a more encompassing response.
Sorry, you were saying to read Matt's?
To read Matt's question, yes, because it touches upon performance, which is something we need to address.
So Matt is saying, I agree with you that the issues in value-based cleavages are often overlooked and underestimated. Yet in the discussion, presenters keep coming back to the basic role of performance, corruption, and weak economy. There are exceptions. Nothing seems to be able to sink AMLO, for example, but it still seems like a ruling party needs to get their performance right more than it has to get its issue-based appeals right. Would you agree? Or there is a chance that programmatic representation can buy space for weak performance?
Can I address that also in relation a little bit to the adjustment measures that were discussed before? I think Matt points to an interesting aspect of this, which is how far are ideological voters willing to go and defend their government if performance is poor. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's really the definitive test of any ideological issue-based voting argument, right? And it touches upon a bit the issue about adjustment measures that we were discussing before on Carlos Khalil's question, right? Or the issue he raised. Voters will punish incumbents for poor performance in office, especially when it affects the economy. We know that. I mean, that's probably one of the laws of voting behavior, right? Retrospective economic voting has a significant effect on incumbents' electoral outcome. And I'm not questioning that at all when I'm calling attention to also the role of issues and resentment, as Juan mentioned, right? Because that was also an important aspect of all this wave of support for populist governments across the globe. It's not a Latin American exclusive phenomenon. Issues or better aspects of affection, right? Affective kind of positioning towards politics, hate politics, and resentment against elites have been in the roots of explaining vote choice in many of these cases where leaders who appeal to elite mass divide, which is the way we've been classifying populists recently, have gained electoral success. So incumbents need to do well. I have no doubt about that. However, we have to keep in mind that the deepening of political cleavages and therefore of polarization, it increases probably, and I think we need to test this better, the strength of rationalization that voters employ in justifying their choices, right? We know also that voters, when they're making their choices, sometimes ignore facts, ignore performance based on their ideological preferences, especially when they gain this very strongly ingrained position in defining their way of lives and how they see the world. I think the more polarized cases of political systems leave no doubt to that. I think the United States suffers of this kind of situation nowadays. It doesn't matter what an incumbent Democrat or Republican does to a Democrat and a Republican. They're always going to vote the same way, and they're going to rationalize their vote choices, right? So what I'm saying to Matt is obviously that performance matters, and I think the resentment against the PT comes from ideological aspects, but also from their somewhat poor performance in the latter years regarding the economy and politics overall. But that these growing cleavages, especially in Brazilian politics, and it might be the case that this is different from other Latin American cases in that the polarization is not so clearly defined as it has become in Brazil, that performance might even be secondary, right, for the core supporters of these two different sides. I'm sure Bolsonaro supporters, which I said amounts to a significant amount, a significant size, right, of the Brazilian population, about 20 to 25%, they favor his negationist positions towards the pandemic. They share those views. They share his views about pesticides, the use of pesticides, agrotóxicos, right, on food production. So it goes beyond what we would expect in Brazilian politics, and it touches upon a huge number, let's put it that way, of issues that today are in the political agenda of the country. So I think as a system polarizes more, you know, these ideological divides in some cases may become stronger, and they could in some ways reduce the pulverization or the hyper-factionalization of political party systems. So the crystallization of preferences in different groups, and you need opposition for these things to crystallize, right? You need conflict for them to gain body, probably leads to less fractionalization. And in some ways, this is what we see, but in Brazilian presidential elections. But again, we have to take into consideration the electoral rules and the electoral system that orient the elections to understand this more than just voters' preferences. Okay,
certainly
I would say to all these different questions. Thank you. Sorry.
Yeah, certainly the case of Mexico also fits in this pattern where there's, you know, from above polarization to overcome and somehow paper poor performance in policy and mobilize, activate your voters across polarized ideological lines. Let me move to Scott Morgenstern, who is asking, we really haven't gotten back to Javier Corrales' question. So I will leave you with that and move to Scott. While there are continued discussions of turns to the left or right, the utility of those terms has changed due to new cross-cutting social and other issues. From a spatial modeling perspective, these new issues could split the parties and potentially attract voters from the traditional left or right. How should we be thinking of the traditional left-right scale today, and how does that affect the way we should apply traditional models?
Creo que la multidimensionalidad que conocemos de la política puede colapsarse razonablemente bien en términos de izquierda y derecha, y eso es una cuestión contextual, ¿no? Hay algunos sistemas políticos en donde la multidimensionalidad de los asuntos colapsa muy armónicamente en una única dimensión ideológica, y hay otros sistemas políticos en donde esto no es así. Sabemos que los modelos espaciales funcionan muy bien y son muy bellos cuando la política es unidimensional, ¿no? Cuando la política es multidimensional, y además de ser multidimensional, esas múltiples dimensiones no están ordenadas armónicamente, entonces hay problemas. No obstante eso, me da la impresión de que aquí de lo que hemos estado hablando es de cuestiones que son espaciales y cuestiones que no son espaciales. Entonces, las cuestiones no espaciales tienen que tener un tratamiento no espacial, ¿no? Es decir, es muy difícil, salvo que todos aquellos que odien al PT o todos aquellos que odien a Cristina Fernández de Kirchner en Argentina tengan exactamente los mismos valores no espaciales. Pero eso no sucede. Empíricamente no sucede. Entonces, dado que esto es así, me inclino más por la idea de aplicar modelos espaciales con algunas reformas puntuales que tengan que ver con el contexto. Es decir, sin conocer los sistemas políticos, sin conocer cómo se distribuyen los valores entre el electorado, es muy difícil poder subsanar, ¿no?, las cuestiones que los modelos espaciales no captan. Pero bueno, estoy pensando en voz alta nomás, la verdad. Lo tendría que pensar un poco más.
Pero en general tú defenderías esta idea de que los modelos espaciales siguen siendo, con ajustes y contextualización, aplicables para seguir explicando la variación en sistemas de partidos.
Bueno, pienso que sí. De hecho, nosotros venimos de una tradición en donde América Latina tenía... quienes estudiaban América Latina tenían muchas dudas y muchas sospechas acerca de de cuán posible era aplicar modelos espaciales en América Latina, porque existía una presunción, a mi juicio equivocada, pero una presunción al fin de que la política latinoamericana discurría por canales no programáticos y no ideológicos. Entonces, a mí me parece que en todo caso el proceso es al revés, ¿no? No solamente que los modelos espaciales pueden seguir aplicándose, sino que en algún punto tenemos que empezar a aplicarlos, porque de lo que estamos hablando hoy es de dos trabajos que intentan explicar la política latinoamericana en los términos en los que la política se explica en distintas regiones del mundo, y yo no veo por qué eso no podría ser posible y fructífero, ¿no?
Perfecto. Nos movemos a una pregunta de Pablo Andrade para Lucio. Saludos a Pablo. Me gustaría volver al tema de los impactos políticos de la pandemia y las respuestas de los gobiernos. ¿Es que la pandemia ha creado un nuevo clivaje en el electorado brasileño o de hecho solo ha consolidado los clivajes existentes?
Yes, thank you for the question. I think it hasn't created new cleavages in Brazil. I think it has become another component of this right-wing conservative Bolsonarista, I would like to make that clear, alignment in Brazilian politics. And that's what has become something that actually surprises me, because it really didn't exist before, before Bolsonaro. It surprises me that Bolsonaro has become such an important political actor in Brazilian history, because through his rhetoric and as I said, the convergence that it has with public attitudes, mass politics attitudes by a portion of the Brazilian public, he has been able, and this argument has been able to be constructed including many dimensions. So it has the economic neoliberal dimension, it has the law and order dimension, it has the social values, moral values dimension, which includes gender, a reaction towards gender politics, for instance, is what I'm talking about, issues of abortion, gay rights, so on and so forth. And it has a dimension linked to food production and the use of agrotóxicos. It has a dimension linked to conspiracy theories, which is something we're starting to test now in Brazil, and see how adhesion to conspiracy theories is linked to Bolsonarismo. And finally, the pandemic. His negationist positions towards the pandemic, that there are alternative cures, that we don't need to use masks, that it's a small flu, that we shouldn't lock down the economy because of the pandemic, it resonates with this portion of the public. So all of these things are coming together to create a radical right-wing pole in Brazilian political spectrum. And it's actually reorganizing the system in that way, because what before was more fluid and less precisely defined is now really becoming a division between Bolsonaro and anti-Bolsonarismo. And in that sense, Diego, it's a little bit like the anti-petismo, right? The resentment towards the PT, which is fluid. It includes a lot of people in that group. Now, the new fact in Brazil is the re-emergence of Lula da Silva, and through him of petismo, as the other pole, as the antagonist to Bolsonaro. And if that really happens, we'll have a very competitive and harsh election next year that will be dominated by these two political forces in Brazilian politics, and they will represent different ideological and issue positions in the country. And I think that those debates will become even stronger, to the loss, I would say, of performance, right, that Matt was mentioning here. So yeah, and also Matt, looking at your next point, it's interesting that I think I have difficulties in generalizing what I'm seeing in Brazil to many other countries. So I'm talking mostly of Brazil here, but I feel that there is an increase in polarization in many other countries around the world, especially because of this late populist, radical, extreme, right-wing wave of governments that appeared around the world. But again, I'm not completely sure that this polarization is something that will in Latin America will be as strong as it probably will become in Brazil in the next few years.
It's certainly a useful shortcut, cognitive shortcut to mobilize voters. I wanted to see if Javier is still around and give him the privilege of doing a last minute shot from halfway the court in the last minute that we have. Javier? Otherwise, I will bring your attention back to his question. And what he's thinking about is whether there's a way to predict by looking at voters' preferences when a party system will hyper-fractionalize. So I guess this polarization that we are talking about, this tension, this mobilization of voters will translate into a more polarized party system. And I was hoping he could clarify the semi-authoritarian regime's condition. But why don't we start with the first part?
Go ahead.
Javier, would you like to elaborate on?
Oh, well, thank you. I didn't mean to monopolize this. I just, I'm wondering if it is, one of the things that happens under semi-authoritarian regimes is that the opposition many times collapses and other times it unites. Is this something that could be studied by looking at voters' preferences or not? Is this a supply-driven phenomenon?
There's an agenda, a research agenda.
Bueno, no, yo estaba pensando, sí, es una pregunta complicada, pero yo, digamos, tiendo a pensar del siguiente modo. Digamos, la polarización ideológica, si tiene algún efecto sobre la fragmentación, es a disminuirla, ¿no? Porque lo que permite digamos, es una estructuración, digamos, eficiente digamos, de distintos partidos bajo un mismo eje ideológico. Entonces, uno debería esperar que la polarización ideológica tenga un efecto negativo sobre la fragmentación en general. Sí, yo lo que no logro entender bien es cuál es la conexión de Javier con los regímenes semi-autoritarios.
Porque los regímenes semi-autoritarios polarizan, por un lado, pero muchas veces los partidos se dividen irremediablemente a la hora de enfrentarlos electoralmente, a pesar de una polarización que sale en casi todas las encuestas que se realizan. Ese es el puzzle, el enigma.
En contra del gobierno, sino divisiones entre los votantes mismos.
But let me just put one point here. I think, and that's what I think I tried to say before, but I said it very quickly. I don't think that this is very much related, Javier, to voters' preferences. I think it has more to do with institutional rules that affect the coordination among elites and how they organize parties to compete. So in my view, this is more of a consequence of elite-driven decisions. And I think that's what you're asking, right? I mean, is this demand induced or how do you call it? Oferta.
Supply.
The supply, yeah, thank you. Oferta of the supply, right, of politicians based on their coordination strategies, and those are very much dependent on the electoral and institutional rules of the party system and of the electoral system. So that's how I would react initially. And if preferences have any effect, I would certainly agree with one that they tend to reduce fragmentation and pulverization, right, of party systems, because they reduce the system to two different positions that are against each other, right? And Brazil is, I think, becoming a very good example of that. But again, this is at the national level, right, where institutional rules based on majoritarian systems for presidential elections in Brazil tend to reduce the number of political competitors in the system. It's not the same for the legislative elections that Andres mentioned just a few minutes ago, and we didn't have a chance to address. Andres, I'm talking here of presidential elections, right? I'm not really, if we go into legislative elections, then the issues and the divisions are much greater. And we can't really talk of polarization at legislative elections in Brazil, for sure. I mean, that doesn't exist there.
Yeah. Excellent. I will have to bring this to a close. Como decía la abuela, de lo bueno poco. So we're going to leave the audience wanting. We have a fantastic group of participants, and if we were in a real setting, we would go out for drinks and continue this conversation. But I can only just thank everybody for attending. Encourage you to read again these fantastic papers, and keep your questions and suggestions coming to the Charlemos team. If you have any ideas about the format, about the possible themes, etc. And just thank our brilliant speakers, Juan Andres, Diego, and Lucio, for sharing this conversation tonight.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Muchas gracias. Un placer.
Gracias. Hasta luego.
Chao.